Breaking news. Canon has launched the new R3 sports camera. 6K video, 30 frames per second, and the weather sealing of a 1DX. It is truly a flagship camera at $6,000. It's amazing, and it has one serious flaw that nobody has told you about. I have analyzed footage carefully and found out the truth behind that 30 frames per second. I'll tell you about it. But first I'm going to tell you about Squarespace. Squarespace makes beautiful websites that anybody, even me, can set up. Just drag your pictures in, tell them a little bit about yourself, and you have an amazing web presence that simply blows away social media. Take orders from clients, set up appointments, get your own domain. That's what your online web presence should be. Get started at squarespace.com/Tony. When you love it, after the free trial, use the coupon code Tony and you'll get 10% off. Thank you, Squarespace. First, a warning about the landslide of embargo videos that you got about the R3. They're all based on a pre-production camera. What that means is, for even those people who have the camera hands-on, they're not necessarily entitled to say negative things about the camera. This is how it works, because we've done this a lot. If you find a flaw in a pre-production camera, you say to the camera company, hey, I'm experiencing this bad thing. And they say, that's because it's a pre-production camera. And then you're not really allowed to talk about it. The people who did get their hands on it only had it for a very limited time, so there was no real world long-term usage for it. The other group of people are ambassadors. They're people like Peter McKinnon, who I'm a big fan of, but he is a Canon ambassador. He is sponsored by Canon. You should treat these videos more like advertisements, because that's what they are. They are given a list of things that they should say and a list of things that they can't really say, and it's always kind of gonna be upbeat. They're never going to expose any types of problems. Here's the challenge. This is all the information you have to determine whether you should pre-order the camera for $6,000 or not. I don't think that's fair. That's why I want you to be aware of the potential sources of concern for the information that you see about this camera, and encourage you, just wait a little bit until you actually put your order in. The Canon R3 is primarily a sports camera like the 1DX Mark III that it's largely based on. These are professional sports shooters. Like, I know lots of people shooting high school games and stuff. A lot of them are using, a $300 Canon T3. But if you are working for ESPN, they'll usually put a Canon 1DX Mark III in your hands. And nowadays, Canon wants them to put a mirrorless camera in their hand. They want to push these shooters over to the RF lenses and show them all the advantages of things like mirrorless systems with no viewfinder blackout. Canon is trying to position this against the Sony sports cameras, which have been out for several years now, like the A9, the A9 Mark II, and the Alpha 1. These professional bodies also serve general purpose professional photography roles in the fields of portraits and weddings. And nowadays, most portrait and wedding photographers that I know are shooting mixed stills and video. The Canon R3 is perfectly positioned for these professional hybrid shooters because it has a flip forward screen, it has excellent video autofocus, and really good general video capabilities that we'll talk about in a second. I will say it's not a wildlife camera. That's because it's only 24 megapixels. You can shoot wildlife with 24 megapixels or less, but the challenge is it's full frame and 24 megapixels, and if you want to really fill the frame with faraway subjects, it means you need to stack an extra teleconverter on there, and when you really stack enough teleconverters on there for typical wildlife subjects, you end up with a very narrow field of view, and that increases the challenge over, say, a 50 megapixel camera, where you would have substantial room to crop. And thus, I think I'm still going to be steering wildlife photographers to cameras like the Canon R5 or the Sony Alpha 1, which offer the best of both worlds, high megapixel counts and high frames per second. That's why I'm categorizing this more as a sports camera. The frame rate is 30 frames per second when you're using the electronic shutter. This camera, like most mirrorless cameras, has two types of shutters. The electronic shutter, which can be silent, but suffers from a little more of rolling shutter and flickering under LED lights. The other shutter is the traditional mechanical shutter, which mostly eliminates those problems, but because it's mechanical and needs to physically move up and down, it's significantly slower. When you're using that mechanical shutter, you're limited to 12 frames per second. I will say, based on my experience with the R5 and the R6 from Canon, I don't see any real reason to use the mechanical shutter. Even those cameras, which are not as fast as this one, the rolling shutter is pretty minimized. We have found a few conditions where it does show up in pictures. Canon, in their marketing material, is saying these pro sports photographers do not want 50 megapixels. That's why we only gave them 20 more megapixels. The truth is, I don't totally believe that. I think Canon released this 24 megapixel camera because they weren't able to produce a camera that could push 50 megapixels at 30 frames per second. I think they ran into processing limitations or overheating problems. You know, if you use a camera like the Canon R5, you can produce lower res JPEGs, and that's what a lot of professionals are going to be able to do. If you shoot with a lot of high res cameras like the R5, you can produce lower resolution JPEGs. Thus, if you are an ESPN photographer who wants to spit out 24 megapixel files to your editor as fast as possible, you absolutely have that option. And in fact, those lower res files are going to look a lot better because they're downsampled from a higher resolution file. So having a high res sensor does not prevent you from producing small lower res files. That seems like a myth. I think Canon wanted to give you everything. High res, high frames per second. I think Canon wanted to give us everything. A high res sensor that could produce scaled down images on demand. That would increase the versatility for many types of professionals and improve the overall image quality. I think they just weren't able to. Canon said that the lower megapixels produces better high ISO output, but in all of our testing across so many generations of cameras, we have never found that to be the case. In the latest generation of shootouts, we tested the Canon R6 with 20 megapixels against the 12 megapixel Sony a7S III. In high ISO, the 20 megapixel Canon R6 produced better, cleaner images than the lower megapixel camera did. In fact, you can scale it up to 50 megapixels, 60 megapixels on the Sony a7R IV. We do not see a significant increase in visible noise. Yes, per pixel noise will be higher because there are more pixels, but that doesn't matter anything when you're viewing an image or printing it. What matters is the total amount of image noise, and that's based more on physics and the total light gathered than how many pixels are in it, based on our real-world testing. When we recently tested the Canon R5 with 20 frames per second against the Sony Alpha 1 at 30 frames per second, we found something interesting. There were a lot of scenarios where the Sony Alpha 1 didn't reach that peak 30 frames per second. All manufacturers, when they talk about the frames per second, they're talking about a theoretical frames per second with no autofocus. But that's not an especially realistic scenario, because usually when you're shooting action, you're shooting a moving subject, and thus you need continuous autofocus. And when you have to continually autofocus between each picture, the camera has to take a beat, scan the scene, adjust the focusing on the lens, which requires moving physical motors, moving optics in the lens, and then shoot and repeat. And because there's some action happening between frames, that slows everything down. That adds time. The slower that lens is, the slower the focusing is, the lower your frames per second are going to be. What's happening in 2021 is we've removed the bottleneck from the camera shutter itself. We've shifted that bottleneck to the lens, and that is limiting our performance improvements. I don't have an R3 to do the testing on, but one of their ambassadors did post some videos of continuous shooting. And so what I did was I went through frame by frame in the video and counted the number of frames per second based on the screen. This is not super precise. I would rather test it myself, but I will tell you the numbers that I found. In a wide angle scene with a 15mm lens, he got 22.4 frames per second approximately. So that's significantly shy of the 30 frames per second because, of course, the camera has to take a beat between pictures. I guarantee you, if you aren't focusing or if you're tracking a still subject, you'll probably hit that 30 frames per second. With subjects running towards the frame, there were a couple of different tests. I counted 19.7 frames per second. Excellent, amazing, not 30 frames per second. In another test, I counted 19.2 frames per second over a period of more than a second. Why is this a big deal? Because these are almost the numbers that the Canon R5 produced, and the Canon R5 is $3,900 and shoots 45 megapixels. So it's producing better quality, more detailed images at a fraction of the cost and a similar frame rate. And this camera's crowning achievement is the high frames per second. This also means that maybe it's not a Sony Alpha 1 competitor, but it's more like a Sony A9 competitor. After all, the Sony A9 and A9 Mark II have 24 frames per second, and in the real world, we found that they get a real 20 frames per second. Stick with me, lots of other big improvements with this camera. One of them is a maximum fastest shutter speed of 1/64,000th of a second, which is pretty crazy, right? Like the R5 will do 1/8,000th of a second, but there are still times when we're out in the sunlight shooting with one of our favorite lenses, the 50 f1.2, doing portraits, and we want to shoot wide open, and 1/8,000th of a second isn't enough. And in those situations, you need to put an ND filter on, which is a pain. It reduces image quality, adding glare and stuff. Faster shutter speeds provide more versatility and are very useful. It can also use the electronic shutter in a studio environment with strobes with a sync speed of 1/180th of a second. This is a first for Canon. You cannot take an R5 or R6, slap a strobe on them and use the electronic shutter. They just disable the flash. I don't really know why you want this other than not having to change the mode on the camera. After all, shooting silently doesn't really help you, and it only achieves 15 frames per second. So you're not really going to be shooting at 30 frames per second with a strobe anyway. Nonetheless, we're glad that you have that option. It is a convenience. Canon has also worked to reduce the flickering under different types of lighting. This is a serious problem when using the electronic shutter. The R5 and R6 do quite a bit of flickering, and it can be obvious when shooting in artificially lit environments, like shooting an indoor basketball game. And that might be what really drives Canon shooters to the R3 over the R5 and R6. Not the frames per second, which we're not necessarily seeing pan out, but this reduced flickering that gives you more confidence when shooting in these environments. Like the Sony Alpha 9 Mark II, they've built a feature in that will allow you to fine-tune the shutter speed. And indeed, we do find that with that fine-tuning ability, we're able to get up to 1/500th of a second without showing any flickering, whereas without that ability, it might be more like 1/200th of a second. So the flickering basically shows up more with faster shutter speeds, like 1/2000th of a second. And this allows you to get higher and higher without having that problem, without having to switch to the mechanical shutter. So I can see why Canon's putting so much effort into it. They also have extended their flicker reduction ability to the electronic shutter. Previously, it was only in use in the mechanical shutter where you didn't really need it that much. This also translates to less rolling shutter when you're shooting because it's all correlated to the readout speed of the sensor. So every time the manufacturer improves the sync speed, that's because the readout speed improved, and there's a direct correlation to how much rolling shutter you'll see. It's not really a problem for us in sports, but sometimes in wildlife or shooting a fast moving car where you're whip panning, you will see some of those rolling shutter effects in stills. This camera advertises 8-stop sensor stabilization, and indeed with our R5 and R6, the sensor stabilization is pretty amazing, and Canon is the leader here. If you're looking for long handheld shots, Canon is the way to go. This is a bit of a surprise. I expected it to have 2 CF Express Type B cards. After all, shooting at super high frame rates, you want that data to clear as fast as possible. Canon threw us for a loop and gave us 1 CF Express Type B, a fast card, and a slower UHS 2 SD card. I don't like this, but it does provide more versatility for pros. It means that if you are working with an editor who can only use SD cards, maybe they only have an SD card reader, you could hand them the SD card. You have that extra versatility. SD cards are also cheaper, but what it does mean is that if you're shooting RAW, you'll probably be shooting RAW to the CF Express card and JPEG to the SD card as a backup. That way the SD card doesn't become a bottleneck. I guess they're saving the dual CF Express cards for the EOS R1, which we hope to see next year. Let's talk about the video capabilities. This is a hybrid camera. People will use it for both stills and video, often on the same scene. A bit of a surprise, it shoots 6K at 60 frames per second, raw internal. I hate using an external recorder, and it's really only Canon offering this raw video internally. And when we've worked with the R5's AK 30 frames per second raw video, it processes beautifully, and in high contrast situations does produce noticeably better results. I love it. It's just it takes up so much space. I basically never use it unless I have to. I, in fact, would rather have 6K at 60 frames per second than 8K at 30 frames per second. So this is a win for me. I'm loving these video capabilities. It'll also do 4K at 120 frames per second in 10-bit, which is pretty similar to what we're getting out of like a Sony a7S III. So to have that bundled into a camera that can do it all is exciting. Jordan from DP Review found that it did overheat while he was shooting video. This is going to require further testing because there's a lot of different permutations of frame rates and codecs and environmental things like how hot it is where you are. And he didn't really get a chance to suss it out. So that's something we're going to have to pass it over to like objective reviewers with production cameras before we can give you a proper number on it. Canon did finally remove the 30-minute time limit. There is no longer any EU taxation that would require this. It is simply Canon preventing you from using these as serious video cameras so they don't cannibalize their own cameras. It's frustrating on those cameras. I wish they would release a firmware update to fix it, but I'm glad they didn't put that into the R3. This camera has a nice high-res electronic viewfinder with a 1600 by 1200 resolution. It's not as sharp as a Sony Alpha 1 or Sony a7S III, but it's good. It's going to look nice. But what's noteworthy is the rear screen is very high resolution for a camera at about 1280 by 1024 or 4.1 million dots. That is significantly sharper than most cameras. And that's actually the screen that I use the most for things like reviewing pictures, showing them to a client. I don't know why the rear screen on every camera up until now has sucked. So thank you, Canon, for finally taking that seriously and giving us a proper high-res display. Let's talk about the eye tracking autofocus. This is not eye detect autofocus. Eye detect autofocus will find the eye on a subject and focus on it. Canon's excellent at that. This is something that we haven't seen since the 80s or 90s. This is eye tracking. Eye tracking AF is something I haven't seen since my old Elan 2E around like 2000, the year. Eye tracking AF is something I haven't seen since my old Elan 2E in like the year 2000. The way it works, you can look at part of the frame and Canon will look at your eye and see where you're looking. Here's how it works. This is something I haven't seen since like the year 2000 when I had my Canon Elan 2E. It sucked then. It seems to be greatly improved now. Here's how it works. You look at part of the frame and the camera is looking back at your eye when it's up to the viewfinder, and it can say, oh, Tony's looking over here. I'm going to find a subject in that general area and try to focus on it. It does not have like pixel level precision. It just kind of generally says he's looking in this rough part of the frame, he's looking in this rough part of the frame. But still, based on early feedback, it seems like this is genuinely useful. There are some challenges I think are going to maybe be deal breakers for the professional users, though, in that it requires calibration, and at least according to Chris at DP Review, it requires recalibration on a regular basis. Like, it doesn't necessarily hold your settings, and it's not necessarily learning from your eyes that adjust to different situations. So I'm wearing contacts right now. I would have to calibrate it with my contacts. Sometimes I shoot without glasses or contacts. By adjusting the diopter, I would need a recalibrator for that. And then when I put my glasses on or sunglasses on, each of these are going to require different recalibrations. And each time I'm in a different scenario, I have to remember to go into the menu system and adjust it. It doesn't automatically detect whether I have glasses on or not and choose it. And well, that slows people down. My real concern is that at some point I'm going to pick my camera up and go shoot an event, and I'm going to forget to change it, and then I'm going to miss some shots because it's not going to be properly calibrated. And even Chris in the DP Review video said that he would probably end up just using a single point autofocus. Nonetheless, it's a pre-production camera. Canon is still working on it, and I'm excited to see it when the software is actually ready and find out whether it's going to work well in the real world. Canon also warned us that it doesn't work that well with light eyes. So people like me with dark eyes might have better luck with it. They did advertise some improvements to the autofocus algorithm, but generally I think the autofocus is going to be comparable to the R5. What they did improve was they added the ability to track vehicles, and they're weird. It's not like regular passenger cars, it's like race cars specifically, and that makes me think that it's looking for the high areas of contrast, like the big numbers and advertisements that tend to be on it. Nobody yet knows if this actually works. But good news, I am confident that this will trickle down to the R5 and R6, since this does seem to just be a software change. I keep an eye out for a firmware update. Another future firmware update is the improved custom white balance. In the past, for some reason, Canon cameras have had a really difficult process to set a custom white balance in unusual lighting conditions. This camera allows you to finally do it through the viewfinder quickly, which is what every other manufacturer has done for a long time. That will speed things up, but Canon also says that they've improved the white balance algorithm. Now, we almost always shoot RAW, and even if you're shooting JPEG, it's pretty easy to fix the color in post, so it's not something I tend to do, but those who do it will appreciate it. I'm going to tell you how it compares against the Canon R5, the Sony Alpha 1, the Sony A9. If you are going to pre-order it, you can use this link here, sdp.io/R3. Canon expects this camera to ship in November 2021. I would expect those to be extremely limited numbers because of the chip shortage, which is not going away anytime soon. The latest things I'm hearing is we might not see the chip shortage end until like 2023. I know I've been waiting on a Canon 600mm f4 lens for wildlife, $13,000 lens. I ordered it as soon as it was announced, like 6 months ago or something, and I'm still waiting for it. You just can't get stuff anymore. Now let's see how the Canon R3 compares against the Canon 1DX Mark III, which is really its most direct competitor. Canon isn't necessarily trying to steal Sony or Nikon or Fuji users at this point. They just want DSLR shooters to upgrade from their Canon system to their mirrorless system. It's a little cheaper at $6,000 compared to $6,500, and that's a pretty good value because it beats it in almost every way. It offers 20% more pixels. It's significantly lighter, like 30% lighter at 2.2 pounds. One way it loses is the mechanical shutter. The 1DX Mark III is capable of doing 16 FPS with the mechanical shutter, though it's more realistic. More realistically, we tend to get like 12 or 13 FPS, like real world stuff. The R3 will do 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter, and I would guess that it gets pretty close to that. So the real difference isn't going to be that much. When you're shooting with the electronic shutter, which again could have banding under artificial lights, you can theoretically get 30 frames per second, though what we've seen so far shows that that number might be more like 20 frames per second, which is right where the 1DX Mark III is. The R3 has a faster top shutter speed at 1/64 thousandths of a second compared to 1/8 thousandths on the 1DX Mark III. Not something I ever heard people complain about, but the R3 also has a flip forward screen, making it more useful and versatile for hybrid shooters who shoot stills and video, or for people who do things like commercial or product photography where you might need to be in front of the camera, manipulating subjects, holding lights, etc. The biggest advantage is going to be that the R3 has a silent shutter, allowing you to attend a press event without making that clanking sound. A lot of press events now require silent shutters so that they're not screwing up the mic. That's an incredibly powerful tool. And the EVF, which allows you to preview your exposure in the viewfinder, review pictures in the viewfinder, record video with the viewfinder. I personally find that to be an extremely powerful professional tool. I'm sure 1DX Mark III users will appreciate it once they spend some time getting used to it. How does the R3 compare to Canon's own R5? Well, it's much more expensive at $6,000 compared to $3,900. It has much lower, the sensor captures way less detail, only 24 megapixels compared to 45 megapixels. It's bigger and heavier. The mechanical shutter captures the same amount of frames, 12 frames per second. The big advantage here, R3 can theoretically capture 30 frames per second, though as we saw, that number might not actually pan out in the real world. The fastest shutter speed, 1/64 thousandths of a second, is much faster than the R5's 1/8 thousandths of a second, but again, not really too big of a problem. The video capabilities on the R3, 6K at 60 frames per second raw. The R5 does 8K at 30 frames per second raw. You pick which of those you like better. I would prefer to have 6K at 60 frames per second. There is no recording limit on the R3, but it might be overheating. The R5 definitely overheats, but it also has a 30-minute recording limit, which is something we run into. That is a real world problem for people like wedding photographers who might want to set up a camera and forget it, but also people like me who ramble on for 30 minutes in a video like this. The R3 is weather sealed, which is going to be a big deal for pros who don't get to say, oh, it's raining, I'm going to go inside. If you're a pro and you're stuck outside, the R3 is a better choice for you than the R5, which can't handle nearly as much moisture. Given the revelations about the lower frames per second, I think the closest competitor to the R3 is the A9 Mark II. Shockingly, the A9 Mark II is way cheaper at $4,500. It's also lighter. The R3 definitely beats it in specs for the frames per second, but we'll wait until we get our production copy to see if that actually pans out. The A9 Mark II's video is really weak. It doesn't have a flip screen. It only records 4K 30 video, so if you are a hybrid shooter, Canon here is a big win for you. And finally, let's compare the two flagship cameras from the two biggest camera companies right now, the Canon R3 against the Sony Alpha 1. The price is about the same, but the Alpha 1 captures more than twice as many megapixels, giving you far more detailed images that are way more useful when you need to crop for scenarios like wildlife. The Alpha 1 is significantly lighter in the field. They both have a top frames per second of 30 frames per second with the electronic shutter. Neither one of them hit that in the real world all the time, but we'll have to test them side by side to see which is actually better for those shooting action. They both shoot flash with the electronic shutter, not that you need that, but the Alpha 1's a little faster at 1/200th of a second compared to the R3's 1/8. The Alpha 1 a little faster. The Alpha 1's 1/200th sync speed is a little faster than the R3's 1/180th sync speed. That's not going to make a difference to anybody, but it is an interesting measurement as far as the sensor read speed goes, because that difference probably correlates to the amount of flicker and the amount of rolling shutter that you'll see as well. It's just like 10% difference, probably not going to make any difference to anybody. The A1 does 8K at 30 frames per second, but doesn't shoot RAW internal. You have to attach an external recorder to do any kind of RAW. The R3 will shoot 6K at 60 frames per second RAW, and the R3 has a flip screen. So for those of us shooting video, the R3 is clearly a better hybrid shooter. I also want to point out, Sony tends to win everything on specifications, but Canon is a little more difficult to capture because I switch between my wife's Canon R5 and my Sony Alpha 1 on a regular basis, and they're such similar but such different cameras. Like, I always subjectively love the way the Canon handles. The user interface is just more friendly. You can do things like adjust settings with the touch interface or scrub through video. The autofocus just, the subject tracking, the subject detection and tracking on the R5 just seems to work a little bit better. But then I still use the A1 as my main camera because it's just got that like raw horsepower of 30 frames per second and so much detail and all the dynamic range and stuff. So you're not, point being, we're not really comparing apples to apples by just looking at the specs. One of the most important, here's an announcement. Here's an R3 feature that will be coming to the entire Canon lineup soon, and that is they are changing their hot shoe. They're not calling it the multi-function shoe, and they're allowing you to do things like connect microphones to it. I suspect we're going to see lots more accessories for this, including Canon-specific microphones that function, well, exactly the same way as the Sony microphones that we've been using in Sony's multi-function shoe. In other words, Canon is finally catching up with Sony's functionality. And that's good, because this has actually pushed us towards Sony cameras for a long time. It is backwards compatible with Canon's old hot shoe attachments, but if you want it to be weathered sealed, you have to put an adapter on there. They also announced the Sony EO1 flash to go in this multi-function hot shoe. It's $1,100. I will be happy to test it, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to stick with my cheap Godox flashes. I'm sure they're not as good as this, but what I do is I pack 2 or 3 Godox flashes. If one breaks, I just throw it out because they're like $180 compared to $1,100. But what I do like is they have a little wireless transmitter, which is very small, only $120, and just has a menu button as the interface. So if you want to adjust your remote lights, you push the menu button and then the menu pops up on the back of the screen. I much prefer this over the big clumsy transmitters that I have to use with other cameras because I just want it to be light and I don't need a second user interface on my device. Here's one of those microphones that I was talking about. It attaches directly to the hot shoe. This would be perfect for vloggers. Notice no cables to get tangled that can come loose and ruin your entire recording. If I sound bitter, it's because it's happened to me a lot. Canon also advertises the mobile file transfer, which is cool. It allows you to connect your smartphone via a USB cable to the Canon camera, and then you can transfer files via FTP across the cellular network with no Wi-Fi connection at all. Really cool, but when I tested it the last time, it didn't work. I just couldn't get it to work and I gave up. And I noticed the app here has 2 ratings and they're both 1 star. So I don't get the impression this is working on the real world very often, but I would like to test it when we can get our hands on the R3. Now let's talk about the things that I'm kind of disappointed about. It's totally unfair of me. This camera is not even out yet. It's something brand new that didn't exist before. So how can I complain about it? Well, it doesn't have GPS, which is so annoying to me because GPS tagged photos are so cool. Go into your iPhone now or your smartphone and go into the Photos app and just look at the map view and you can see where your pictures were taken. As a professional photographer, if you're thinking, oh, I got that picture at Red Bull Stadium, I remember it was in 1999. Now you can go into Lightroom and narrow it down by location if they're GPS tagged. But you can't do that with this camera unless you use an external adapter. It also still has no internal memory, which means if you forget your memory cards, you're out of luck. And yeah, pros forget things all the time because you're working on a schedule. Internal memory also has the advantage of being far more reliable and faster. While Canon gave us that cool little tiny adapter that fits in the hot shoe, why not just put that in the camera? So we don't need to buy a separate accessory that can get broken or lost. In fact, why don't you give us one radio that allows us to control remote flashes and synchronizes with remote microphones or remote headphones so the camera can be totally cord free. You know what that would allow you to do? It would allow you to permanently seal up all those ports, making it even more weatherproof. Connecting your smartphone to your camera through a USB cable and then uploading stuff to the internet is cool, but you know what would be way cooler? Just paying $10 a month and adding your camera onto your current cellular plan so that you could just transfer stuff that way. Of course you can do that. My watch has a cellular connection. It doesn't take up a lot of space or use a lot of battery power. Build it into the cameras already. There's also no apps. Every camera manufacturer still uses very primitive operating systems rather than building them on Android or something that would provide so much more flexibility. As a result, things like live streaming to Instagram or TikTok is impossible. And there's a world of creators who rely only on their smartphones for these things now. And the reason is your cameras would produce better images, but the functionality isn't there. Open it up. Just give us just one camera that has the flexibility of the Android operating system. Please subscribe. That's how you support independent creators like ourselves. We have never taken money or free gear from any camera manufacturer. Ask the other reviewers if they can say the same thing. Please support the independent, objective reviewers by supporting our sponsors like Squarespace. When you need a website, which is always and right now, you should use squarespace.com/Tony. Set it up for free. See how easy it is to use. Mine has been 100% reliable. I've sold so many prints on it over the years. It literally pays for itself. It looks so much better than just your social media, which is filled with ads and they can pretty much take it away from you anytime you want. Squarespace.com/Tony gets you started. When you love it, use the coupon code Tony and get 10% off. Thank you, Squarespace.